Hi, everybody. I want to read to you a piece I wrote recently called Butchers Liars Reprise. Not much more than a week ago, I wrote a rather incendiary piece for The Telegraph about the mutilation of young people in the name of so-called trans rights. I also read it on my YouTube channel and broadcast it, or soon will, on my podcast. The Telegraph entitled it, "We Are Sacrificing Our Children on the Altar of a Brutal Far-Left Ideology," which wasn't too bad, focusing as it did on the analogy I developed between our current practices and the literal sacrifice of children to false gods. I was somewhat more direct online, calling the piece Doctors and Psychotherapists, Butchers and Liars, which was about as blunt, let's say, as it was possible to be. I was very nervous when writing, and even more when reading this piece. I was, after all, calling out the casual, pathetic, and cringing compliance of the psychotherapeutic community, and suggesting, again, somewhat bluntly, that the sadistic and greedy surgeons, masked by an appalling moral self-righteousness, should be jailed for practicing their fiendish and ghoulish craft on children. I have had my fair share of conflict publicly as a consequence of opposing the increasingly insistent encroachments of the radical, compassionate left. But I thought I might have finally signed my death warrant, culturally speaking, with the Butchers and Liars piece. But no, almost all the comments on the YouTube posting, which has been watched by 1.4 million people and responded to by 15,000, were positive. I removed some of the more purely asinine and juvenile criticisms, mostly of the "you're an anti-Semitic Nazi fascist, so f you and the horse you rode in on" variety. And the YouTube comments algorithm removed some with similar intent. All things considered, however, positive. The same thing happened on the Telegraph website, where some 1,200 comments have been posted. This came as a genuine shock, not only to me, but to the editor I had been working with most closely at the Telegraph, who emailed me 2 messages. Quote, "I have had multiple conversations with fairly diehard liberals over the past few weeks that this issue is leading them to flip-flop on the trans debate. They are usually ending up going too far in response to the trans kids' situation and end up aligning with the right-wing fundamentalist Christians on trans as a whole. This is what it looks like when we say that the left will end up eating itself." End quote. New quote. It was remarkable the near universal support this piece received, and how high its readership figures were and continue to be. We expected more of a backlash from the usual suspects. It just underlines how the views of a tiny minority have infected the mainstream. As always, evil flourishes when good men stand aside. It's all part of the same authoritarian mindset, and too many people being happy to let others make decisions for them, a symptom of a general absence of critical thinking or feeling of powerlessness in Western populations at large, I fear. Perhaps there's a follow-up piece to be written commenting on this before we publish the next one, remarking on how well received your essay was, and offering some solutions as to how to defeat the liars and butchers. I'm often struck by the yearning among readers for writers to offer solutions as well as insight. End quote. Why are we butchering children if no one thinks it's a good idea? And I would ask those reading and watching, listening, to think very hard about that question and consider the mere fact that it has to be asked at all. Why are we butchering children if no one thinks it's a good idea? Well, there's a financial moral hazard at hand. Each so-called trans kid is a veritable lifetime goldmine for the pharmaceutical industry, all those hormones and then all the drugs necessary to deal with the oft catastrophic physical and psychological consequences of the surgery. Then there's an issue, I believe, of the genuine sadism combined in some cases with personality disorder of a very pathological sort. There are always going to be a small percentage of medical personnel, including surgeons, who have a dark triad personality: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and psychopathy, just like there are in every other profession. But nurses, psychiatrists, and most of all surgeons with those characteristics are in a prime position, first, to hurt others to gratify their own hellish impulses, and second, to do plenty of damage merely by being narcissistic. Then there's the issue of the mob. For at least a decade now, anyone who spoke out against any manifestation of this modern hyper-compassionate constellation we know as woke idiocy was very likely to be vilified, ostracized, and shamed, to be threatened seriously on the employment front, to be tarred and feathered and transported out of town on a rail. I have conversed in detail and length with at least 100 people to whom this has happened, and it's no joke. I would consider it roughly equivalent to being cursed with a serious illness. It hurts people a lot, as well as constituting a genuine threat to employment and personal safety. This is particularly true of conscientious, reliable, dutiful, hardworking people who are also prone to guilt and who can be manipulated by the dark triad types because of their moral nature. And social media rewards this. Nothing goes viral like an accusation. Nothing can make a nobody somebody like the accurate delivery of a poisoned dart. And if you add a bit of cowardice to the mix, and the willingness, even on the part of so-called mental health professionals, to take the easy short-term pathway forward, you have the makings of a sociological disaster. The issue of the mob and its amplification by social media is further complicated by the disproportionate potential impact thereby generated of a tiny minority. I asked recently the journalist Andy No, a very brave person, Asian and gay, for those of you who care, soft-spoken and gentle, but with a spine of steel, and a good thing too, because Mr. No has been beat half to death 3 times by the compassionate radicals. How many active cells might be operating in the US, and how many full-time employees, so to speak, might make up the committed core personnel of those cells? He estimated 40 and 20. 40 times 20 is 800. 800 people in a population of 320 million. That's 1 in 400,000. That's practically 0. But that's what the moderate Democrat types, skeptical of the very existence of Antifa, note essentially when expressing their doubts about the dangers of the radical fringe. But that's the wrong conclusion. What's the proper moral of the story? A very tiny minority, left unchecked, can exert a disproportionate and deadly influence on an entire society. It was hardly any communists, after all, who overthrew the Tsarist regime in Russia and instituted the many decades of vicious horror that characterized the Soviet world. All societies struggle with the problem of free riders, narcissists, Machiavellians, and criminals. All societies struggle to control those who build false, inflated reputations, who are willing to sacrifice others to their own selfish and narrow short-term interests, who will rob and steal to attain, and, worst of all, who will burn everything to the ground just to gain the opportunity to dance demonically in the resultant ashes.